Hi, it's time for another verb of the day. Today's verb is collide. Let's take a moment to look at some of the definitions of this verb. The first way you'll hear collide used is to mean to hit with force when moving. Okay, so with this first definition, many of the times you see this particular verb used, it's going to be in connection to car accidents. And this verb will specifically be used to describe when one hits with force, perhaps another car or another object, a building, something of that nature. A second way you'll hear collide used is to mean to clash or come into conflict. So with our first definition, I'm imagining that we could all sort of picture this idea of a car coming into contact with something. The second definition here, there's not something so much we can see, but we can sort of imagine different ideas, different opinions clashing or I guess, in a way, feeling like they are being kind of hit with one in a forceful way. So that's the second definition of the verb. You should know that collide is a regular verb. To make the progressive form of this verb, you need to drop the E on the ending and then add ing to form colliding. The past tense and participle forms of this verb can be made by just adding the letter D, since this verb already ends in an E. Our base verb, collide, ends with a D sound. D sounds are always voiced, and when we go to add ed endings to verbs that end with a D sound, we end up making an id sound, and we end up adding an extra syllable to the verb. So the past tense should sound like this: collided, collided. I hope you can hear that extra id on the end. Now let's take a moment to look at one phrasal verb. And this phrasal verb isn't all that different, but to collide with generally implies that we're coming into contact with something, and usually it's happening quite suddenly. So it might be a bit of a surprise. An example of this: a train collided with a vehicle Sunday night. So again, we can probably imagine or picture that idea of a train coming into contact or hitting the vehicle. Now let's practice our verb of the day in a couple different verb tenses. Today we're going to focus on the simple present and the present perfect. Let's start with the simple present. We use this verb tense to talk about habits and routines. We also use it to discuss facts. And the important thing for us to pay attention to as we make affirmative sentences in the simple present is to pay attention to that subject. If our subject is I, you, we, or they, we want to use our base verb. So just as it's spelled, collide. Okay? But if our subject is he, she, or it, I need to add an S to the end of this verb. Okay? Let's take a look at an example sentence now. The judge's approach to sentencing routinely collides with residents' expectations of justice. Okay? So here is a sentence that would tie back to our second definition. So we're not talking about things physically coming into contact or hitting one another. Here we're talking about kind of different points of view, different approaches, I think is the word used here. The judge follows one approach and other people in the community kind of think like, no, that's wrong, right? So that's the conflict. Okay. Approach is singular here, judge's approach. That's like saying it. So if you notice, I've got an S on the end of the verb. Okay. Now, if I want to make a negative simple present sentence, again, I'm going to pay attention to my subject. My subject is I, you, we, or they. I'm going to use do not and then the base verb. If the subject is he, she, or it, I'll use does not and then the base verb. Here's an example. In our workplace, different viewpoints and ideas don't collide. Instead, they combine to form even greater impact. Okay? Some leaders have used statements like this when they're trying to recruit others to join their company and trying to sort of reassure them. We want people with different viewpoints, different experiences, and it's not going to create problems or conflict. It's going to be a good thing. Okay? Lastly, let's look at making a yes or no question in the simple present. We do this by starting with do or does, whichever form matches our subject, and that subject comes next. Then we have the base verb. So I want to quickly point out, notice the only time I'm adding an S to the end of the verb is in the affirmative when the subject is he, she, or it. In all other forms, I don't add the S. Let's take a look at the example question in the simple present. Do cars collide at that intersection very often? Right. So again, I'm asking is this a habit? Is this something that occurs regularly? And occasionally there are places where there are many accidents, maybe because of how the road has been designed or bad signage. Could be many reasons, people not paying attention. Now let's move on and talk about the present perfect. We use this verb tense to talk about actions that started in the past and continue into the present. We also use it to describe something that might have occurred at an unknown point in the past. Sometimes you'll hear books call this, or books or teachers call this, the indefinite past tense. Okay? And with the present perfect, we also need to pay attention to our subject. Okay? I like reminding students present perfect has two P's in its name, and I want my students to remember that that means I need two parts to make my verb. So if my subject is I, you, we, or they, I'm going to use have and then the participle form of my verb. But if my subject is he, she, or it, I'm going to use has and then the participle form of the verb. Here's an example sentence. Two military jets have collided in mid-air in a horrific crash. Okay? So in this particular sentence, we're not being told when this accident occurred, when they crashed into each other. Now let's look at a negative present perfect sentence. To do this, again, I pay attention to my subject. Based on what that subject is, I'm going to use either have not and then the participle, or has not and then the participle. Here's another example sentence. These two teams haven't collided in recent seasons. So sometimes this verb collide gets used in sports. And I think many times it's being used to kind of give us that physical sense of how hard athletes compete, that it feels like a physical fight as well. So here we might, another way to say the same sentence, these two teams haven't battled in recent seasons. Okay? So for whatever reason, they just have not played each other in a game. Lastly, let's look at a yes or no question in the present perfect. To do this, I start with have or has, then I'm going to have my subject, and then the participle form of the verb. Here's my last example. Has the spacecraft collided with any asteroids along the way? So again, maybe we're talking about some voyage, some trip that started long ago, continuing into the past. It's still continuing. And so we're checking through that process. Has an asteroid come into contact with the spacecraft? Now we're going to spend just a couple minutes looking at some words related to our verb collide. And the first word we're going to look at is the noun form of this word. We say collision, collision. Okay? This word can also have a couple different meanings. One way to use this would be to refer to an instance. You might think of this like an event of one moving object or one moving person striking another object or striking another person. An example of this might be, there was a collision on the lake between two jet skis. So again, we might be able to kind of imagine these two things coming into contact. This tends to be used when it's really harmful contact, right? If I give somebody a fist bump or a high five, that's not a collision, even though we're coming into contact and making contact with one another, because it isn't done in a violent way. So that's maybe an important point to note about this noun and even the verb. A second way you'll hear the noun collision used is to refer to a time when there is conflict between opposing ideas or between opposing interests. An example sentence of this: public outrage is once again on collision course with Washington partisanship. I've seen sentences like this as there have been many protests throughout the U.S. in the last week in reaction to the murder of Tyree Nichols, his attack, his beating, and people being just shocked and horrified that any human being could be treated that way. And so many people believe we need to make changes, right? But that thought of we need to make changes is likely going to come into conflict with how slowly our government works, and how if one party wants to do something, the other party seems to disagree. And unfortunately, that many times when we have these opposing ideas in politics, nothing gets done. One last word that you might encounter, that's the noun collider. Now, this word has a very specific meaning in the scientific community. So it's referring to an accelerator of where we have beams of particles, and these beams are meant to collide with one another. So come into contact with. Let me go to the example sentence here. Colliders are used as a research tool in particle physics. Now, if this is confusing to you, don't worry. I am the furthest thing from a scientist, so I'm not going to do a very good job of explaining what this is, but you can search YouTube for some better graphics and video probably that shows and demonstrates this. This noun, again, is so very specific to the scientific community. So if you're not working in that space, don't worry. Or if you're not taking classes in that area, don't worry so much about encountering this word. But thank you so much for watching today's video. I hope you have a great day.